is shown the figure of a man in armour, cut in stone, having something like razors set in his backplate. He is represented in the act of thrusting his sword down the throat of a dragon or serpent. The tradition, which is typified by this ancient figure, and which for centuries has been identified with the Lambton family, now represented by the Earl of Durham, is one of the most singular and notorious in England. Burke, in his Vicissitudes of Families, gives the tale at some length, but derives it chiefly from Surtees, the historian and antiquary, and from him, with some few additional particulars from other local authorities, we purpose giving it in a somewhat abridged form. According to the old legend, the Lambtons were so brave that they feared neither man nor God, and apparently had no respect for the Sabbath. One Sunday, therefore, the reckless heir of the race, according to his profane custom, went to fish in the river Wear, and after trying his piscatorial skill for a long time without success, vented his disappointment in curses loud and deep, much to the distress of passers-by on their road to church. At length his luck appeared as if about to change, for he felt something struggling at the end of his line. Pulling it carefully to land, in expectation of capturing a great fish, he was woefully disappointed and enraged to find it was a worm or snake of repulsive appearance. He cleared it from his hook and flung it into an adjacent well, remarking to a passer-by that he thought he had caught the devil, and requesting his opinion on the strange animal. The stranger, after looking into the well, remarked that he had never seen anything like it before, that it was like an eft, but that it had 9 holes on each side of its mouth, and opined that it betokened no good. After a while, the heir of the Lambtons repented of his evil courses, and proceeded to a distant land, in order to wage war against the infidels. During the 7 long years that he was absent from home, a most distressing and unexpected state of affairs had come to pass. The worm or serpent which he had flung into the well on that desecrated Sabbath had grown so large that it had to seek another and more capacious place of residence. The locality which it selected as its favourite abode was a small hill near the village of Fatfield, on the north side of the river Wear, about 1.5 miles below Lambton Castle, and at last so great was its length and so great was its strength that it could and would wind itself round this hill, which is upwards of 300 yards in circumference, in a triple chord, in such a manner that traces of its folds have remained almost to within memory of the last generation. It became a terror to the whole country, committing all kinds of devastation on the flocks and herds, and poisoning the pasture with its reeking breath. In vain did the knights and gentlemen thereabouts endeavour to slay this promised success, that is to say, conditionally upon his making a solemn vow to kill the first living thing which he should meet after slaying the worm. Lambton agreed to the conditions, but was informed that if he failed to keep his word, the Lords of Lambton for 9 generations should not die in their beds. No very great hardship, it might be deemed, for that martial age. According to his instructions, the knight had a suit of armour covered with razors made, and having donned this, he instructed his aged father that when he had destroyed the worm, he would blow 3 blasts upon his horn as a signal of his victory, whereupon his favourite greyhound was to be let loose, so that it might run to him, and therefore be the first thing that would meet him, and thus be slain in fulfilment of his agreement with the witch. The father promised and gave his blessing, and young Lambton, having made the vow enjoined, started on his dangerous expedition. As soon as he approached the hill round which the worm was coiled, it unwound itself and came down to the riverside to attack him. Nothing daunted by its hideous aspect, the knight struck at it with might and main, yet without appearing to make any impression upon it beyond increasing its rage. It now seized its opponent in its horrid folds and sought to strangle him, but the more tightly it grasped him, the more frightfully was it wounded, the razor blades cutting it through and through. But as often as the monster fell to the ground, cut by the knight's terrible coat of mail, as often, says the legend, did the severed pieces reunite and the wounds heal up. Lambton, seeing that the worm was not to be destroyed in this way, stepped into the river Wear, whither the monster followed him. The change of position proved fatal to the worm, for as fast as the pieces were cut off by the razors, they were carried away by the stream, and the monster, being unable to reunite itself, was after the desperate conflict at last utterly destroyed. As soon as Lambton had achieved his victory, he blew 3 blasts upon his horn, but his father, in the excitement of the moment, forgot to have the greyhound unloosened, and in his impatience ran out of the castle to greet his son, and was the first living being that met his gaze. The knight embraced his father, and again blew his horn, upon which the hound was let loose, and running towards Lambton was slain. But this was too late to retrieve matters, his vow having enjoined the slaying of the first living creature that he should meet with, and his father had been the first to meet him. So the curse was on the house of Lambton, and for 9 generations not one of its lords could die in his bed. Sir Bernard Burke points out that popular tradition traces the curse back to Robert Lambton, who died without issue in 1442, leaving the estates to his brother Thomas, but bequeathing by his will to his brother John Lambton, Knight of Rhodes, 100 marks. In an ancient pedigree, this John Lambton, Knight of Rhodes, is described as he that slew the worm, and as Lord of Lambton, after the death of 4 brothers without male issue. His son Robert is said to have been drowned at Newbrig, near the chapel where the knight had registered his rash and unperformed vow, and tradition specifies a bedless death for each successive 9 generations of the Lords of Lambton. After succeeding brother, General Lambton, who lived to a great age, fearing that prophecy might be possibly fulfilled by his servants, under the idea that he could not die in his bed, kept a horsewhip beside him in his last illness, and thus eluded the prediction. Although the spell put on this ancient family by the witch is said to have been broken by the death of Henry assistance was required immediately by a person of rank, and that she should be handsomely rewarded, but that there were reasons for keeping the affair a strict secret, and therefore she must submit to be blindfolded, and to be conducted in that condition to the bedchamber of the lady. With some hesitation the midwife consented. The horseman bound her eyes and placed her on a pillion behind him. After proceeding in silence for many miles, through rough and dirty lanes, they stopped, and the midwife was led into a house which, from the length of her walk through the apartments, as well as the sound about her, she discovered to be the seat of wealth and power. When the bandage was removed from her eyes, she found herself in a bedchamber, in which were the lady on whose account she had been sent for, and a man of a haughty and ferocious aspect. The lady was delivered of a fine boy. Immediately the man commanded the midwife to give him the child, and catching it from her, he hurried across the room and threw it on the back of the fire that was blazing in the chimney. The child, however, was strong, and by its struggles rolled itself off upon the hearth, when the ruffian again seized it with fury, and in spite of the intercession of the midwife and the more piteous entreaties of the mother, thrust it under the grate, and raking the live coals upon it, soon put an end to its life. The midwife, after spending some time in affording all the relief in her power to the wretched mother, was told that she must be gone. Her former conductor appeared, who again bound her eyes and conveyed her behind him to her own home. He then paid her handsomely and departed. The midwife was strongly agitated by the horrors of the preceding night, and she immediately made a deposition of the facts before a magistrate. Two circumstances afforded hopes of detecting the house in which the crime had been committed. One was, that the midwife, as she sat by the bedside, had, with a view to discover the place, cut out a piece of the bed curtain and sewn it in again. The other was, that as she had descended the staircase, she had counted the steps. Some suspicion fell upon one Darrell, at that time the proprietor of Littlecote House and the domain around it. The house was examined